Thank you all for joining us this evening at our first office hours session of the academic year. My name is Erin Sidrovich. I'm the director of the Alumni Engagement Program here at OU, and I am doubly happy to be hosting tonight's session because it is our annual homecoming and reunion week. So I want to send a special welcome to all of our students and our alums who are out there joining us this evening. Thank you so much for being here and being a part of this great week. We're really excited to get started with a wonderful discussion between Dave and Elaine. But before I hand it off, I do want to let you know of a couple of housekeeping details. We are presenting this via Zoom webinar, and so it is being recorded. For those of you who are interested, you will be able to access this recording after tonight's session, so you will have the opportunity to review it later or to send it on to others. We'll make sure to get that to you within the next few days. It will also be available on our office hours website. In addition, we are going to be taking questions tonight via the Q&A feature. So if you look down toward the bottom of your screen and scroll down in that general direction, you'll see where it says Q&A. That's where you can submit questions, and we will be able to take those from you in that format. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to first introduce Dr. Dave Julio, Professor of Political Science and the Chair of the Center for Civic Engagement. So Dave, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Erin. It's great to be back with office hours for the 2021-2022 academic year. As you mentioned, it's been a great partnership with the Alumni Association and the PACE office on campus, Professional and Continuing Education. We started this about a year ago, and it's been really successful. It's been terrific to be able to come together once a month or so and feature faculty experts from Oakland University and get their knowledge out to those who are interested in learning more. And we're going to do that tonight with our new dean, Elaine Carey. But before I get to that, I just a couple of notes about office hours. One, if you're a return customer, glad you're back. You know the drill. This is about, but if you're new, welcome, maybe for the first time. It's a way for us, as I mentioned, to feature faculty experts in support of Oakland University's community engagement efforts. This has been so successful that Erin and I and Amy Oland, our other partner, have been invited to talk about it at a couple professional conferences. First at the Council for Advancement and Support of Education, a group that Erin is a member of. And then we're also going to present this, the concept of office hours at the meeting of the Coalition of Urban and Metropolitan Universities, something that OU's been connected to for several years now. But enough from me. Elaine, it's great to have you tonight. Thanks for doing this. We know you're really busy as dean, so to extend your day and take some time to talk to us about your work is really terrific. I'm not going to introduce you because I don't want to not do it justice. So I'm going to ask you to tell us a little bit about yourself. For those who might be here who aren't familiar with our new dean, tell us about yourself, where you were before you came to OU, what is it about Oakland University that made you want to come here and be our new dean?
Great. Well, thanks for having me, Dave. I'm really pleased to be kicking off the series for this year and thrilled to be in the virtual space with you this evening. So again, my name is Elaine Carey, and prior to coming to Oakland University, I was Dean of the College of Humanities Education and Social Sciences in the Purdue system at Purdue University Northwest. And I was really drawn to coming to Oakland, one, because it's a College of Arts and Sciences, which means it's just, you know, the heart and soul of the university. But also just being familiar with how Oakland has changed over the years and its growth, and as well as, you know, just more programs and a bigger footprint, and all of that is really attractive to me. I'm also an urban historian, and so I'm interested and have built my career always in large universities and also in urban spaces. Or urban and metropolitan, as we're using in the term. So I was thrilled to be selected, and I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, we're delighted you're here, and I hope for the umpteenth time, welcome to Oakland. We're a month deep into the semester, but it's never a bad thing to say welcome yet again. So, we're here to talk about your research and your expertise. And when I was thinking about how we would let folks know about this, the idea of what seems to be a glut of television shows about drug trafficking came to mind. And when we were talking the other day in a little practice session for tonight, I learned so much already. But there are things that folks are familiar with about drug trafficking, and one of those people that they're probably familiar with is somebody named El Chapo, and he's been in the news many times, right? But the story doesn't end with him, right? His wife played a really big role. So tell us a little bit about El Chapo's wife.
So I'm actually going to talk about one wife in particular, but there are 4 wives, not all at the same time. They're divorced, but they have 3 of them have played a large role within the Sinaloan drug trafficking organization. His most recent wife, who was pled guilty in June to drug trafficking and conspiracy to traffic drugs, Emma Coronel, really comes from, everyone talks about her being a beauty queen, and we actually titled this, and she is a beauty queen. Drug traffickers, particularly the Sinaloa DTO, but also others, sponsor beauty pageants throughout Mexico. And so she was in a beauty pageant, and she won. Now, that may seem like, well, she's, very attractive, and women will enter these to get money for college and things like that. Emma Coronel did not need to enter a beauty pageant to get access to any type of resources. Howard Obadinsky, who wrote the textbook on organized crime and is a mentor of mine, he would say that Emma Coronel comes with credentials. She comes with high-level credentials. Her father, Inés Coronel Barreras, is a high-ranking member of the Sinaloa drug trafficking organization. So she comes with a level of confidence that she provides. She also comes with substantial family wealth, and she comes with knowledge of the business. So Emma Coronel was seated next to her husband when he was being tried in the United States. She does have US citizenship as well as Mexican citizenship. Her sons and his sons were born in the United States. She was moving back and forth across the border and internationally quite easily. And she was arrested upon entering into the United States. But she and Guzman's other wives are involved in the drug trade. In fact, his 2 former wives fall under the Kingpin Act in the United States, and their assets have been frozen in the US, but they have not been arrested in the United States.
So I need to go back to something that was at the start of that answer. The beauty pageant aspect of this. So this is a strategy that the cartels use for what end?
So they sponsor, well, for a lot of things. I mean, in part, it builds relationships. It is, they're providing for the community, because through those beauty pageants, just like in the United States, women will receive college tuition, they'll receive resources, cars, things like that. So there's that aspect. But it also means that they will meet very young and promising women too.
So it's a recruitment tool.
In recruitment in per se, it can be, but usually it leads to, in some cases, relationships, intimate relationships.
Got it.
So in this case, but like I said, Emma Coronel is exceptional. She comes with credentials. She is, what I have found in my research is that she didn't need to be in a beauty pageant. She most likely would have been aligned within, the family business. She comes with a lot of wealth, and we see that in drug trafficking organizations where they will, very similar to royal families or something like that, they will merge their resources to control greater territory and to establish more success. And so this is not uncommon, especially at those higher levels.
So maybe this is where I was going with that question about recruitment. When and how do women really enter into the drug trade? Maybe from a historical perspective, but also a practical one as well.
So historically and currently, frequently women come in with their family members. So drug trafficking is hierarchical. It's an organized crime. There are people who are at the top who are leaders, and remember, those are exceptional people. The majority of people are not leaders of drug trafficking organizations or DTOs. They're low-level street vendors, they're low-level mules, they're users, they are not the leaders. So what you see is exceptional people move into those roles. And what you also find is that among certain families, the exceptional child to lead the family business is a girl, is a woman. And so they might be trained by their fathers and recruited. They could also be trained by their mothers. They may come in with a partner, a husband who is in the business. I mean, kind of like in the film Traffic, Catherine Zeta-Jones' character comes into the business. She doesn't know about it, but she really finds that she's quite successful at it. So it may come through, that a woman is in the business because her husband is in the business, or her partner, an intimate partner. It could also mean that she brings her intimate partner into the business because maybe she's the one who has those family connections. So historically, it's what we see, but we also see currently.
So, and those roles that women have played in the drug trade for years and years and years, correct? How have those changed over time?
So, there are lots of roles in the drug trade. So, drug trafficking organizations are highly sophisticated, multinational criminal syndicates. They move across borders and they move across place. So, initially, the first case that I found of a woman who was referred to as a queenpin was a woman who was in an organization in 1917. Operating in both New York, California, but also Mexico and Canada. And, and she was working with men, but that's the first time that I found evidence of using that term queenpin. So, again, she comes in, she's listed as working with her husband, but she's seen as one of the leaders of the organization. So you can have women as equal partners. You could have women who are, I've also found evidence selling on franchise for organized crime, working on a commission for organized crime in drug distribution. Maybe they work a particular territory or something like that. They're fixers. They might fix problems. They run stash houses. They are involved in distribution, mules moving back and forth, and they may, part of the reason that women are brought into the Department of Treasury is to, especially along in the borders, is to inspect women and children who were involved in smuggling. So they might be smugglers, they might be carrying it on their person, they might be carrying it inside their person, they might be driving cars. Women and men would train their children to go through international points of entry to cause a commotion. We know that a screaming child, sometimes, people will move them through a little bit quicker. And this was a tactic that was found in documents. So women are in all different levels. And so their bosses, right after the Harrison Act, which really kind of sets off the, that where many narcotics and cocaine are illegal and there's controls placed on them. So we see women involved at that level as being leaders, as well as being mules and very low level sellers of cocaine, heroin, morphine, marijuana.
That spurs me to ask a couple of follow-up questions. But before I do, a reminder to our audience: if you have a question you want to ask, put it in the chat, put it in the Q&A, and we'll get to it. We'll get to as many as we can. So start typing. So the back in 1917, this Queenpin. What was the drug of choice then? What was being smuggled?
Well, in that organization, they were predominantly smuggling heroin and morphine. And so that was what they were doing. Now, other groups were moving, marijuana. There was another woman, Sadie Stock, based in Southern California, who was moving marijuana as well as heroin on ships and boats along the coast of Baja and into California.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. So there were, and they aren't the only ones, right? There's other women who begin to emerge and find that it's a lot more lucrative to be involved in drug trafficking than other types of illicit businesses. And
so either today or in recent memory, however you want to define it, what percentage of, if possible to answer, if possible to ballpark it, sort of how of the drug trafficking that happens, what percentage activity is sort of run by women?
It's interesting because these are complicated organizations. So you will have women in organizations as equal partners. They might control. So for instance, in the Medellin cartel, Griselda Blanco, who's been a lot, in popular culture, and what I look at is her time in Colombia to New York. And she preferred to work with women. Now, she was not in the family. She was involved in distribution, and she controlled distribution to New York City in the early 1970s. And then, of course, once she's indicted in the 1970s, she will flee first to Colombia and then come back to Miami. But there are women all along in her organization, but she sits under the Medellin cartel. She sits under the leaders, Pablo Escobar and the others, but she is very high ranking. But that's why for many years we didn't, she was hiding in plain sight, as I like to say, but she wasn't quote unquote seen as a leader, but she was their most successful distributor. She controlled New York City. And then she's really successful in Miami, and then she's also in California. So again, she may not be seen as the leader, but she was extremely successful and very, very wealthy, and was running her own organization within that organization. And I think that's where it gets complicated. So it's really hard to tease that apart. And part of what women's history and methodology, women and gender history, is really asking a different question of some of those sources. So once I started to ask, if women dominate the informal economic sector across the globe, if we're thinking about open air markets, prostitution, any type of street vending, selling food and alcohol or drinks, you see women across the globe. So why wouldn't they be involved in drug trafficking? It's much safer and very lucrative. And so that's once you start asking that question, all of a sudden you start to see women.
Sure. And so now we've got some audience questions popping in, and they are a couple related to what we've been just talking about. So my good friend Joe Rieger, hi Joe, great to have you here. She asks, because women were involved at all levels of these organizations, did they experience some kind of equality with men in those organizations?
So in certain places, women will prefer to work with other women. So they will recruit within their organization. Griselda Blanco is a really good example. She had lots of women working for her, particularly in distribution, who ran her stash houses, for instance, in New York. But she also had women involved who were physically moving drugs. However, when things become more violent, she will recruit more men. So we see actually almost like looking for certain skill sets. Women are going to be less likely to be detained at the airport. They're more likely to be able to move product through international ports of entry. However, if there are men who are attacking your organization or a threat, you may prefer to hire more men. And so this is one of the examples. The other thing is some women will run organizations that are comprised heavily of their own family members. So the question is this an aspect of equality because they're the leader, or is it in fact because of the family line that the mother, this woman emerges as a leader? Women that I've worked with for many years, Jose Carlos Cisneros Guzman, who's a Sinaloan ethnographer. And what we have found is that women will grow their business much more slowly. And they do this in part to not draw attention to themselves. So they grow it incrementally because they don't want the competition. So men will still see that even if a woman is having success, and I've written about a number of women who have had tremendous success, but they will be threatened by men who believe that because they are women, they can take over their terrain or their area, their distribution point. Sometimes we use that term, the plaza. So we'll see aspects of that. But for many, they are able to kind of navigate those things in some unique ways. And part of that also is as they become more powerful, they act the same way. They buy the judges, they buy the police, and that buys them protection.
Your standard organized crime strategy.
Standard organized crime procedure. And that's what they are. They're organized crime leaders. Drug trafficking is an organized crime. And there was always this idea that there weren't women involved in high-level organized crime until this century. And my argument is no, we see them in the early 1900s.
That's fascinating. So here comes a two-part question. The first one from Kelly, and then as a sort of piggyback on my own. Because Kelly asked, what percentage of women occupy the high-ranking positions? How many Queenpins compared to, say, the mules, right? I mean, where's that? And I guess the follow-up question to that is, this has got to be a really hard subject to study because these folks aren't terribly accessible to interview. They want to avoid as much as they can, I imagine, right? So what are some of the challenges in doing this kind of research? And how does it not limit the conclusions, but what are the big hurdles in doing this?
So I'm a historian, so I'm actually looking at the documentary evidence that is left. So although I do work with scholars of the present, so ethnographers, anthropologists, sociologists, criminal justice experts. And so, as a historian, again, drug traffickers don't leave their papers to archives. So it is a needle in a haystack I'm looking for, and I'm piecing together these stories. And so it would mean just hours in the library, hours in the archives, working with archivists, saying, I think there's something here, do you have anything? Also, a lot of crime material, if it is donated to any archives, such as in the National Archives in Mexico, it is not cataloged. It is not, there's no digital catalog. So literally it's going in and just reading and looking for these things. So if we're looking at the role of women compared to low-ranking women in the organization, mules, versus high-ranking women, my question is always, can we do that same statistic for men? How many men are in the low-ranking areas versus how many men are in the top? So if I was going to look at all the major Mexican drug trafficking organizations right now, of which there are 6, there are among those 6, 10 identifiable leaders that we may have heard about. So how many men do you think are under them? We're talking thousands.
Sure.
And so it's the same aspect. And there are women in those organizations too. Sometimes they're their partners, but sometimes, as I mentioned, they're women who have been recruited because they have credentials. They have their own networks and lines and things like that that are important to the organization.
And valuable too, right? They're coming in with something to offer as that will either grow the business, the business, or you know, or
business. I mean,
I suppose
it's business, but it's
illegitimate. But
yeah.
and Kelly asked follow up here too, right? Wow, how would one survive ethnography in the cartel context? And I know you're a historian, but I imagine that those discussions take place in the circles in the crowd that does this kind of work.
So very carefully, you know, Mexico has one of the highest rates of murders of journalists. So very carefully. And there is a difference between what journalists do and what academics do.
Of course.
And as a very prominent drug researcher in Mexico told me, he said, yeah, they know not that many people read what we write anyway, which I was like, oh, that's offensive, but, it's, you know, but it's different than what a journalist does, but you always have to be very, very careful because, you know, you never know who you're in fact engaging with. And
is it almost like somebody doing undercover police work where they have to go and they are
well, you really can't. I mean, if you're doing ethnographic work, you can't do it as an undercover, as you know, you can't do it as a narc, right? You have to do it as a researcher and a scholar, and you have to let people know who you are and what you're doing.
So they come into it honestly and say, "This is what I'm doing. I want to." Yeah,
I want to
learn
understand.
More about.
I'm looking to understand, and you know, describe the project you're working on, and you go from there. But like I said, the scholars and researchers who I work with, again, very carefully.
I can only imagine. I mean, it's literally life and death that they're putting on the line, right? I mean, that's no doubt the case. Have you heard of anybody that has there been violence against any scholars or academics that have tried to do that?
There have been. And I'm going to speak in generalities. Yes, there have been lawsuits against academics who've been able to kind of make connections from somebody who has success in the legal businesses, but also has other businesses. But mostly, if we're really looking at the acute violence, it is against journalists. But remember, in Mexico, journalists can also be scholars. I mean, that happens here in the US too, but it's very common in Mexico that a journalist will also be working with the university and may be a faculty member with what is referred to as the plaza, which is like tenure.
Oh, wow. Interesting. We've got a bunch more audience questions. Keep them coming, folks. We'll get to them. James asks or says, I'm curious about whether, generally speaking, women who become involved in these organizations had a prior connection, say family, to the organization, or whether there are widespread examples of recruiting talented women to come into an organization as a relative outsider. You talked a bit about the family connections, right? Potentially, but what about those recruitment efforts? Do say men at the top of or whether they're at the top, or maybe they're to borrow a Sopranos reference, a capo, right? That kind of level. Do they go out and they try to bring in talented individuals?
Yeah, I mean, someone may demonstrate talent because they're running a successful crew, you know, so they may control, and you know, an example that Jose Carlos had worked on was a person who was running a very successful ecstasy crew going into El Paso, Texas. And so somebody like that will have demonstrated some skill completely on their own, and it might be recruited into an organization. So yes, frequently, it also can be, recruitment can be because of need, that immense poverty, few opportunities, and in some places, the only employment that is available is very low paid work or being in the drug trade. And so young people are actively recruited. We'll give you this and that, you'll be able to buy your mother a house, you'll be able to buy her, new furniture, whatever that might be. And that's enticing, especially for somebody who only finished secondary school, and secondary school in Mexico ends at what would be 9th grade, and didn't go on to the preparatory school and go on to the university. There isn't a lot of work in some areas because, the agriculture has been, decimated through years of like corn dumping and things like that. That's a whole other topic, but they're drawn to it because of the need too. And so that allows for a pool of recruitment. There are also, what would be known as fresas, which strawberries, who are bilingual and bicultural, and are looking for excitement and have the wealth, and are able to move back and forth across the border very easy. And I'm talking about here on the US-Mexico border, but you can use this analysis in other countries too. So they're drawn to the lifestyle that is now widely depicted in shows such as Narcos and telenovelas, and has been widely depicted in Mexico in kind of narco B films since the 1970s.
I want to come back to that too, because we've got a question on that specifically. But as a follow-up to the recruitment one, maybe the other side of it, the other end of it. Kevin asks, are there any Queenpins who have tried to leverage their position to other positions of influence, maybe in government, or sort of maybe non-crime related for-profit enterprise?
So most of the women who I research historically, not only were they involved in, trafficking hemispherically, but they also had legitimate businesses. Now, sometimes those legitimate businesses facilitated drug trafficking. So for instance, Ismelda Galindo Barragan was married to a very prominent drug trafficker in Tijuana named Mike Barragan. They owned not only, a very successful drug trafficking organization. He was originally from the center of the country. So again, that's an area where poppy is produced. So he would have access to those routes. And then of course, he's right along the US-Mexico border. But they owned the dog track. They owned hotels. They owned the taxi companies that went across the border. This was widely used. Drug trafficking organizations guaranteed delivery on the US side of the border since the 1940s. So that meant they had people in their pocket, not only on the Mexican side, but also on the US side. And they also owned other businesses. So we see that. We see, restaurants, hotels, farms, horse raising, all sorts of different types of legitimate businesses. And ultimately, just like we saw in organized crime in the United States and Canada, they frequently go legitimate after a few decades, after a few generations. And that's something that also happens in Mexico too.
And is that something that is from, if you're able to tell this from the work that you've done, is that because they get tired of running or being chased all the time, or that, hey, we're going to become legitimate so we can have a normal life, as if that's ever possible when you're a drug queenpin?
Well, I mean, there have been examples of that, where, so why do people go initially into organized crime is their ability to access capital was cut off. on the basis of education, on the basis of class, on the basis of access. So if you're looking at Italian organized crime, Jewish organized crime, Irish organized crime, African-American organized crime, and also in Mexico, it really emerges, and there's an accumulation of capital, historically I'm talking about. And you do see people go into legitimate businesses. So I talked about Eva Silverstein in 1917. One of the things I would do is try and track old organized crime groups. So some of the members of her organization in 1917 who were arrested were later developers in Brooklyn in the 1920s. They became legitimate business people. And again, there was an accumulation of capital that facilitated that. Now, were they also dabbling? That's harder to find out because, again, if they're not going to tell the New York City Department of Buildings, hey, we got this money from, heroin, so again, you have to be able to try and tease that out. And sometimes that's hard to do.
I can only imagine because they're just trying to cover their tracks, right? They don't want that to be discovered. That is, and I like how you put it before, they're not leaving their papers for to Kresge Library, right? They're
right. Yeah. Would be great if they did. But, as a historian, it'd be great if they did.
So let's go. You mentioned something earlier, I think that would be good to expand on a little bit. And Aldana asks the same question. Can you tell us a little bit about the Kingpin Act in the United States? Because, we maybe forget is the wrong word, but part of this context are laws in the United States about this activity, right? So what is the Kingpin Act and where do we stand with it today?
What it initially begins to do is to freeze assets in the United States. That's why it initially started. So, and again, if we think about drug trafficking organizations, the money, the sale, the demand is here in the United States and in Canada. Mm-hmm. So that means the transactions were taking place here in the United States and Canada. Now, how do you move billions out of the US into Mexico? Wire transfers, all sorts of things, money orders before, currency exchanges, then wire transfers. So there were things going on within different types of banking systems, but also they're physical money movers. So part of that was really freezing assets initially. And then that also meant with greater concentration and control of also controlling entrance, ports of entry, and communicating with different agencies. And a lot of that would fall under the Department of Homeland Security.
So let's change direction a little bit. And audience members, participants, give us your questions, start typing again. We've got a handful more, but we got time for what you want to talk about. I think because, and I still want to come back to the question of these movies and television programs, that sort of thing. But I think that when we look at this issue through that lens, or when we see it on television or in a movie, we forget that, or can forget, that this is a real thing that impacts people and their life, right? So how does drug trafficking, drug violence, you name it, how does that impact the average person, American or Mexican, Mexican? What are we talking about daily impact?
So in Mexico, journalists and scholars and artists have been doing shows about how our demand in the US is killing them, because we hear the reverse frequently. So there has just been, artists who have been addressing this and in these amazing paintings, as well as scholars and journalists who have been talking about it. So what does it mean there? It has meant that we have now 100,000 people who are displaced more than 1 million who have estimates now have been killed over since, this century. There, and then massive amounts of numbers of people who are fleeing to other countries and requesting asylum. So when we want to think about that violence, the violence is happening here. And I'm not an expert on that violence so much in the US, more so in the violence in Mexico. But the numbers are staggering in Mexico compared to the United States. Now, if we want to factor in the opioid epidemic, and again, that has had a profound impact. But on the reverse, when the US Mexico has historically had a very low addiction rate compared to the United States. When the drug of choice changed in the United States, and this was due, as we all know, due to overprescribing of opioids, which 100 years ago, medical doctors in the US and across the globe said that heroin was extremely addictive, and so is morphine. And all of a sudden we were told, no, it actually can be, controlled and there aren't any problems. Well, we know that's not the case. So, but when the drug of choice shifted from cocaine to heroin, cocaine's still coming across the border, that cocaine had to be absorbed. And it had to be absorbed in a country that didn't have a high use. So what happened was a widespread distribution network of crack. And that happened in the early 2000s. Now, we had a crack epidemic in the United States years before. So that happens in Mexico as the drug of choice changes. And of course, and there were different organizations that emerged in Mexico to deal with that, to absorb, essentially to redistribute the cocaine, to absorb a loss because it wasn't coming across the border. And the way to do that was to make it very inexpensive and to put it in working class neighborhoods.
Sure.
That's what happened. So there's that aspect too, where higher rates of addiction, those have increased this century after 100 years of not increasing in Mexico or having very low increase. And the safety net in the United States isn't very good, but it definitely isn't good in Mexico.
Let's go back to something we talked about before. An audience member is really asking about the maybe a darker side of women's involvement in these organizations. You've talked at length and about how they are can be part of the upper echelons and leaders and have major impact on cartels. But these women that are part of drug trafficking organizations, have they been disproportionately abused or manipulated, especially if they were recruited from, say, a beauty pageant or some other method?
So I'm just finished an article with Patricia Figueroa, who is a Mexican journalist and scholar based in Sinaloa. And we have been looking at the beauty pageants. And one of the things is that, so a drug trafficking organization sponsors a beauty pageant, and a boss selects a young woman for his attention. What is her response to that? If she says no, she takes a risk. If she says yes, it's a risk. And that's one of the things we're talking about, is that it's a double-edged sword. There's no way out of it. Just from the aspect of participating in the pageant and winning, you win attention that in some cases maybe somebody wants, but in many other cases they don't. And so one of the things we've seen in Sinaloa is an increase of death among women who have been in these pageants, and so, disappearances, death, sometimes it's being killed in crossfire, with competing groups, but in other cases it has been targeted. And it was only in this century where organizations started to attack the family members. before they didn't do that. It was highly unusual. And we began to see that happen in the early 2000s. That violence just escalated with the former president's, Felipe Calderon's drug war. And that is where we see massive amounts of displacement and violence and battling groups and all of that. I mean, and so it's substantial. And that is something that continues. And so women are targets. Women and children comprise large numbers of the disappeared, young people in particular, because they are the ones who are recruited and end up being recruited as sicarios, or assassins, or as mules or whatever, and they become disposable. And so there are organizations. So Patricia and I have been working on one organization of mothers, Sabuesos Guerreros, which is warrior sleuths or bloodhounds, warrior bloodhounds, if you want, looking for direct translation. And they're family members of the disappeared. And there have been more people now disappeared in Mexico than were ever disappeared in Argentina or Chile. So, these mothers and family members have to rely on the very organizations to tell them where secret graves are, to then go and attempt to find any remains of their family members. So now we see women are leaders of the human rights movement in Mexico, and there's mass actions on International Day of the Woman every year now. And again, but it's not just, it's with drug trafficking, it's dealing with obviously children, and it's dealing with violence against women, and violence against young people.
So it makes total sense to me that the decision that a young woman may face when fingered by or by the head honcho who's running this beauty pageant, that it's a no-win situation, right? They say yes, they've got a problem. They say no, they've got a problem. What about the decision to be a participant in the pageant in the first place? Are there, I imagine, because of the organization that you just mentioned, and that there are similar ones throughout Central and South America, are they going around telling young women, hey, don't participate in this because this is what's coming next? Or is it a similar situation where they face a no-win situation where they say, even if they say no to participation, they've got a problem?
So yes, they do. They do. Women's organizations have been very proactive in throughout Mexico. There's a very different culture in northern Mexico, and in the areas that, like in Sinaloa and Durango and Sonora and Chihuahua. These are states, kind of they're the golden quadrangle, and where production and everything. There's a very different culture in the north, which is a little more conservative than the center of the country. So yes, women's groups have been saying this. They're also up against a kind of a media machine where women are leading this narco life, and it's seen as really glamorous, and that is, people follow them on Instagram and in social media, and they're thrilled by their lives. I mean, one of them, Claudia Choa Felix, who was tied to one of the assassins in the Sinaloa organization, she was referred to as the Kim Kardashian of organized crime. I mean, she had thousands of followers, and so these things sometimes are attractive to young women. So on one hand, you have, yes, women activists who are really saying things that need to be said and talking about those dangers, and then you have these other voices, and so especially for somebody who's young and maybe of modest means, who sees a ticket out of a life that is maybe not the best, and whether it's a beauty pageant or being with somebody in these organizations, it happens.
Well, right, and we see that in the United States too, with
Yes.
with gangs, right? With as that for unfortunately some see that as their only way out, right? And that sets off then a chain reaction of just more and bigger problems. I imagine that your point about Instagram and social media in general, I imagine, gets at a question that Adolfo asked a bit ago about the glamorization of this and is, but in the 5 or so minutes that we have left, I do want to go back to a question that we got earlier, Aldana again, and several questions have come in similar to it, and I had it on my list as well. These movies and television shows that we are probably familiar with. What was it? The House of Cards, or when The West Wing comes on, people ask me as a political scientist, how lifelike are those? Does that really happen? Right? So that's really the question here is how realistic are those Hollywood characterizations of the drug trade and women in the drug trade, because they're certainly throughout those throughout many of them.
Some of them are pretty accurate. Frequently they focus on a masculine narrative in Narcos. There is the appearance of women in the organizations, such as Enandina. One of the things that's interesting in women in the contemporary organizations, they usually have a higher level of education than the men. So, the DEA was always like, gosh, we keep arresting, the Arellano Felix brothers, and the organization just keeps going. Well, they weren't arresting the women, and the women were the ones who had the college degrees and understood how to run the business. The men were more of the muscle. And so we see aspects of the women kind of on the fringes and stuff, but they are a little bit more accurate, I think, than some earlier, but they are sensationalized, right? So there's a lot of things that aren't, but they're showing the generations, which I think is significant, where, it's not just one, they show the complicated networks and the competing and the changing alliances that take place within the drug trafficking organizations. The splintering, how some break off from others. So that is pretty accurate. The Queen of the South, which was written by a Spanish author, but that author had worked with Elmer Mendoza. Elmer Mendoza is a Sinaloan writer, and he took, and I'm just can't remember his name right now, and I apologize. I think it's
happens to us all.
But, yeah, but Mendoza took him all over Sinaloa and really kind of introduced him to what was happening in Sinaloa. And he kind of took that aspect and combined it with things that he had seen in Spain. So, so if you're really interested in some great fictional work that is based on fact, Elmer Mendoza is probably one of the best, although most of his books are not translated. It's a great book called The Assassin, and it's about interviews with an assassin.
And in a similar vein here, we've got a question from David about a specific book. I'm not sure if you've come across it or not, but it's called The New Jim Crow, and I'm not familiar with it, but it apparently has a view of the drug war. David wants to know your thoughts on that book.
So I think The New Jim Crow in that book was talking about the financial implications of the drug war and its impact on mass incarceration. Mm-hmm. And so the estimates, the war on drugs in the United States, the estimates go from, $500 million to over $1 trillion spent. And what that has, and so that money went to mass incarceration, building the prisons, creating the prison industrial complex, and all of those aspects, and very little went into harm reduction, education, and rehabilitation. We also have seen, in that context, what that has done to communities. It's decimated communities. And so it's, I think it's something that analysis is growing. And I think this is why we are seeing a greater push towards legalization. And really looking at some of the draconian drug laws that were put into place, especially, 3 strikes you're out, and heavy sentencing for minor offenses that just devastated lives. So it's a really great analysis, and we're seeing a lot of work that's following a similar line. And in my field in history, that has led to a lot of looking back at some the rise of the prison system and minor offenses, and really looking back at prisoners' records, how they come into the system and then they're just kind of bouncing back in and again for minor crimes, and then very difficult to get their lives on track. So,
sure, I imagine that this is like a lot of things that we could talk about with the context really matters. And it's all of these decisions, whether it's the Kingpin Act or the laws that create sentences or whatever it might be in the criminal code. Those are not happening in a vacuum, right? There's context to all sorts of different things. If you were gonna, and I'm getting prodded that this has got to be our last question, we'll kick it back over to Aaron. But what do you think is something that we could look for moving forward as it relates to drug trafficking, women in the drug trade, whatever, the whole kit and caboodle of what we've talked about tonight? What's something we can look forward to that might happen in the future that would be a major change or shift in how this is dealt with, either from the U.S. side or the Mexican side?
Well, and unfortunately, the level of violence as it has been sustained spills over, right? You can't control violence and think that it just stays contained in one place. And it moves across borders, and it is moving across borders. The organizations, if they can't go across, their traditional ports of entry, they're moving into the Caribbean, and they have been. They're moving and diversifying and aligning themselves with different types of organizations to find different ports of entry. Policing is, again, is that the response, or should we be controlling demand? And really looking at rehabilitation, harm reduction, all the things that we've talked about for 50 years. And really, maybe we should think about giving those a try, because we have spent a lot of money and time, and in the process destroyed a lot of lives in this other response. And I'm not saying that shouldn't happen at all, but what I'm saying is maybe now is the time to kind of rethink that response and really recognize some of the other issues that are feeding that demand. Because if the demand's there, then there will be a ongoing attempt to address that. And so I think that's something that is ongoing concern. And we saw that with the opioid epidemic and how that evolved and how demand kept shifting and other markets were created. Who thought we would be talking about fentanyl and other things, and but we are all talking about that now. So again, those are things to kind of keep in mind. For women, I think, one of the things that gives me great hope is how women have really become leaders of the human rights movement in Mexico, and not only in Mexico, but here in the United States, and how that is having an impact in the way young people think about their lives. And so I think that is something that does give me hope, and I am seeing that impact. Despite those regional differences, women are having more opportunities in Mexico. They're going on to higher education in greater levels. There are no longer job advertisements that insist you have to be a man. 20 years ago there were, and you also had to submit your photo. That doesn't happen anymore. So, things like that are hopeful, but at the same time, there's greater fractionalization among the drug trade. And that means it's harder to kind of figure out as the groups become smaller and more nimble. As many narcotics experts have told me, they become much harder to police. And that's what happened in Colombia, and it's happened in other places. And we're seeing aspects of that in Mexico. They keep breaking apart and reforming and shifting, but shrinking and then becoming more.
Well, Elaine, we could talk about this for another couple hours, I'm sure, but we need to cut it off there. I will say a very quick thank you for being part of the Office Hours virtual series. It was terrific. Great questions from our participants. Thank you all for being here. And let me pass it back over to Erin.
Thanks, Dave. And thank you so much, Elaine. That was fascinating. Really, really interesting stuff. And what a way to kick off our second season of Office Hours and certainly our homecoming week. So thank you so much for that. I do want to present my screen here. Oh, it's not letting me present my screen. I was going to present that we have some information that is available to everybody that is interested in continuing the conversation. But I apologize. It looks like I'm having some technical difficulties here. I did lose my internet halfway through, so that could be the problem. But anyway, what we'll do is make sure that we send that out to everybody. We wanted to make sure that we were sharing some of the journalism networks that Elaine had provided. There were some historical documents that she wanted to share, as well as some Mexican news magazines, in addition to her book. So we have
changed the setting, Erin. Try it now.
Did you? Okay, let me try
I don't know if it works, but we'll try it.
Let's see if I can do it here. Are we seeing anything?
Yep.
Okay, good. There we go. So perfect. We'll come back here to the front. So one of the things that we like to do with Office Hours, thanks everybody for bearing with us, is to make sure that we share information on continuing the conversation. So if you are interested, this is information that we will still email out to everybody, but you can see here some of the resources that Elaine provided just to kind of further your education on this topic or further your interest on this topic. And then also Elaine's book, Women and Drug Traffickers, Mules, Bosses, and Organized Crime is another great resource. And then finally, we wanted to share a little bit here about the three organizations that do co-sponsor this event series each year. The Center for Civic Engagement Facebook page is listed there. Professional and Continuing Education, our friends over at PACE, you can see their website. And of course, I represent the OU Alumni Association at oakland.edu/alumni. Save the date. Our next session is 1 month from today, November 4th, and it is going to be featuring faculty members Holly and Gary Gilbert from the journalism program, which we're very excited about. And then finally, if you're interested in checking out more of what's happening at Homecoming this week, please visit oakland.edu/homecoming for a full schedule. You can also check out the Alumni Association's Facebook page. There's a lot going on in the digital realm on our social channels, so please tune in for that. And thank you so much. We'll see you next time. And again, Dave and Elaine, thank you and good night, everybody.